Working on transit infrastructure projects in British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, or Manitoba? Here are important updates from the Honourable Rob Fleming, BC's Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure, at the 3rd Annual Urban Transit Infrastructure Conference in Vancouver, specifically designed for those involved in the procurement, design, construction, and operation of major transit projects in Western Canada. Join us on June 14th and 15th at the Sheraton Vancouver Wall Centre. To learn more or register for the Urban Transit Infrastructure Conference, visit canadianinstitute.com/urbantransitwest and get 10% off using the code D10-436-construction-record. The code again is D10-436-construction-record and can be used when visiting canadianinstitute.com/urbantransitwest. Hello and welcome to the Construction Record Podcast. I'm digital media editor Warren Frey. This week we have something a little different. ConstructConnect held their State of the Construction Industry 2022 and Beyond economic webcast recently, and I'm going to take you through some of the highlights as a series of experts looked at the highs and lows of the economy in the recent past, right now, and in our immediate future. First up, American Institute of Architects chief economist Kermit Baker sums up where the economy might be headed in the coming months and whether or not a recession is coming.
Most feel that we're not entering a recession at present, but rather we're feeling the fallout from supply chain problems, rising inflation, and winding down of federal stimulus spending. However, the economy is likely to continue to be challenged in the coming quarters. There are enough dark clouds in the future that many feel are raising the prospects of an economic recession sometime over the next 12 to 18 months, even if we're not in one now. So these recessionary indicators include high oil prices, rising interest rates, this tightening cycle we're in now, and history tells us that when we enter a tightening cycle, more often than not, that does end up in a recession. A weak stock market, at least temporarily, we had an inverted yield curve. That's when long-term rates are lower than short-term rates, and generally high inflation.
Next, Fonda Rosenfeldt, the Senior Director of Content Services for ConstructConnect, summed up the unpredictability of the last 2 years as the industry dealt with a pandemic that upended everything.
As construction professionals, we never could have anticipated the ups, the downs, the sideways we've experienced in the last 26 months or so. I find it impossible to avoid certain words such as unbelievable, surreal, challenging, unprecedented, unpredictable, and maybe just downright crazy. So let's jump right in. A term I would use to describe the 5 years preceding the onset of this global pandemic, at least by way of what we see in seasonal bid trends, is predictable. Bid volumes grow through Q1, they taper off and start to fall in Q2. Q3, we experience some leveling off, and then they fall through Q4. Aside from a blip here and there, those trends are steady. That pattern is exactly what we saw in Q1 of 2020. From January through March, we experienced those growth patterns in bid projects. As a matter of fact, the Q1 2020 bid volumes were performing ahead of 2019 by 5% in general building and by 2% in civil work. We were off to a strong start, or so we thought. In mid-March of 2020, our world changed. While through the end of the month, we did not see a measurable impact on bid projects, April crashed. In the US, those lows would continue throughout the year. Our seasonal, predictable, comfortable bid trends were completely disrupted. The construction industry made a great effort to try to find a way to conduct business, moving pre-bid meetings and walkthroughs to virtual events. Office-based employees all moved home, and decisions around whether to allow construction crews to continue to work varied by city and state. All the necessary adjustments were made. But no one knew if these pivots would be in place for days or weeks or months. Did we anticipate years? I certainly didn't. So consequently, we saw the number of projects into the thousands delayed. Some of those projects were just in planning stages. some already in bid, others shovel ready, all delayed due to issues related to the COVID health crisis. Record number of projects were put on hold. Eventually, throughout the last couple of years, we've seen some of those projects move forward, while others were permanently canceled. We also saw changes in project scope, with both public and private sectors adapting to the market. So Canada, also with a long history of stability and predictability in bid trends leading up to COVID, experienced the same as we did in the US, including those shutdowns and delays. The impact in some respects, at least in bid volumes, seemed to resolve and return to more normalized cycle by July of 2020.
ConstructConnect chief economist Alex Carrick also pointed to inflation, currently the biggest problem both construction and the wider economy is facing in 2022.
Going along with high inflation are interest rates that are going up, and then there's the conflict in Ukraine, of course, and that's having an impact on the shortages in the agricultural sector, and there's just a whole range of things. Shanghai, like in China, they've got lockdowns again over in China, and that's impacting the supply chain. But it's not as if inflation is really unique. Between 1951 and 1981, there were 59 months in which inflation was higher than 9%. 59 months, that's the equivalent of 5 years.
It's not all bad news. Baker pointed out there are indicators that give the industry reason for optimism, and Carrick pointed to new factors such as reducing carbon emissions and the use of new materials and alloys that are contributing to economic growth.
There's another set of indicators suggesting that the economy will continue to grow at a fairly healthy pace. Top of the list there is a very strong jobs market, high profits that we're seeing at corporations, solid spending and investment for businesses and consumers, the financial position of consumers, and rising house prices that are generating equity for homeowners. One development recently has been the spike in carbon-based energy sources, most recently due to the Russian energy embargo by the US and other countries. One hope from this situation is that it might provide more incentives for renewable energy sources, which in this environment will be more cost competitive with the rising oil and gas prices that we're seeing. However, as you can see, renewables are much too small of a share of overall energy consumption internationally to fill the gap anytime soon. We can't suddenly make renewables move up to 60% of energy produced as opposed to the 6% we're seeing now. So unfortunately, the outcome in the near term, at least, is to increase production of traditional energy sources to reduce our dependence on imports, which obviously is counterproductive to reaching carbon neutrality.
For the first time in a long time, there's all kinds of major construction projects out there that have been widely publicized. And some of this work has to do with manufacturers deciding to increase production to deal with a supply shortage and also to take advantage of the big price increases that are going through. And some of it has to do with the move towards reducing carbon emissions, and that implies a lot more electrification of the economy, and that implies demand for resources like copper and nickel and lithium. And some of it ties in with usage of other resources. There's new resources that are coming up, like graphite and graphene and polymers used in blades for windmills that are used in wind farms. But also the alloys are used to make steel stronger and aluminum stronger as part of the fight to reduce harmful emissions. So what kind of projects are out there? Well, these are projects really that have received a lot of media coverage. It's not like these are secret or anything. There's just tons of assembly plant projects that are being talked about, the legacy automakers, hundreds of millions of dollars adding up to billions of dollars to be spent by the likes of GM and Ford and Stellantis and so on. and the Toyotas of the world and so on. And it's about trying to make their targets for electric vehicle production to become net carbon zero by 2030, 2035. So what that means is that a lot of these projects really can't be delayed very much if they're going to fulfill the promises that they've made. So that also means that you got to have a lot of battery plant construction. And it's going to be by the car companies, but it's going to be by other companies as well, companies like Panasonic and SK Innovation, that's a South Korean firm. And there's a Chinese company that's a huge company called CATL, and it's looking to build a $5 billion plant in North America. And then there's going to be other things too. There's going to be, well, we all know that there's a shortage of computer chips. So Intel is spending $20 billion in Arizona, and it's going to do the same thing in Ohio, some huge project. And Samsung will be building in Texas. They've announced this. These are projects that are out there in the public record. And then the steel mills. Nucor, U.S. Steel is building a $3 billion project in Arkansas. It's been announced. And Nucor has announced a $3 billion project in West Virginia.
Mobility and migration also saw big changes as people moved during the pandemic and continue to change how the population is distributed across the United States. Both Baker and ConstructConnect senior economist Michael Guckes spoke to the mobility phenomenon.
Another trend that we're seeing is the pattern of mobility in the country and how that's changing as a result of the pandemic. So in recent years, we've generally seen net migration out of the Northeast and Midwest and into the South and West. So just prior to the pandemic, we were seeing migration losses from the Northeast, migration losses from the Midwest, strong gains in the South, and just about no change in the West. The most recent readings showed steeper losses from the Northeast, more modest losses from the Midwest, strong gains in the South, and rising losses from the West. And we can see these trends more clearly when we look at the experience of individual metro areas. New York saw steep losses over the past year. Some of them may well be temporary, we'll see, but at least initially very steep, as well as in other coastal metros with a higher cost of living, like San Francisco, Los Angeles, DC, Boston, Miami, and Seattle. Now, since a net loss in migration in one metro area produces a net gain in another, we saw these gains generally in more affordable areas in the South and West. So of the top 10 migration gainers in the country, between 20 and 21, 8 were in the South, including 4 in Florida and 2 in Texas. The 2 gray bars there are metro areas outside of the South, Phoenix and Riverside, San Bernardino, and those are more affordable inland Western metro, so it follows very similar characteristics.
When we look at all 50 states, we have 10 states that are expanding by greater than 20%. We have 24 states that are expanding between 5 and 20%. We have 8 states that are expanding by our index between 0 and 5%. We only have 5 states that are contracting by somewhere between -1 and -10%. And then there are only 3 states that are contracting by more than 10%. And even within each of those, there's a story to be told. So, when we look at West Virginia, it's not that the entire state is challenged. Actually, the industrial component of the 10 verticals that we are monitoring, industrial is actually doing very well in West Virginia. There are some weaknesses in some other parts there, but and then look at North Dakota, for example. South Dakota there, the EI score puts it in top place. And what we're seeing there is also strong expansion led by industrial and commercial spending. You look at an in-between state, something like a Texas, for example, and you have strength in government, civil, and industrial construction spending. You have below 3% growth, though, for example, in commercial and community construction. And so each state, regardless of how green it is at the statewide level, there are always opportunities in every state, no matter how macro of a picture we want to look at things. There's always micro opportunities. And I really think that our data helps to find those opportunities. Again, the idea being that having a strong local market knowledge is essential.
Rosenfeldt also noted data indicates there's a shift in the kind of awarded projects from predominantly general projects to more civil work.
In the U.S., we are still, to a lesser degree, in this pandemic. Those mitigations, such as safe work practices and vaccines, are in place, and the industry is better informed and well prepared to react and manage the difficulties of essential construction work through these trying times. To that end, bid volumes in Q1 of this year are a record 22% above last year, with Q2 trending to perform 7% ahead of 2021. In Canada, despite their relative stability throughout 2021, we're seeing an increase in bids in Q1 of nearly 5%, with Q2 looking to be very consistent with last year. In both the US and Canada, we are seeing a shift in the makeup of awarded projects. In 2019, our data showed the ratio of general to civil projects favored general work. Quarter to quarter over the last 2 years, we have seen a gradual shift in numbers to projects to more of a 50-50 ratio between civil and general. We can attribute some of those shifts to what we're hearing from our sources. There are longer lead times in project awards, especially impacting the private sector, which is overwhelmingly made up of general work. Additionally, federal stimulus funds may also play a role in ensuring infrastructure in civil projects move forward. Q1 and Q2, we are seeing increases in both volume of awarded projects and average project award values. The increase in Q1 for the US was more than 15% and is trending toward 18% in Q2. We are hearing from our sources, consistent with what we're hearing from our economists, that shortages in labor and material and the cost of labor are impacting construction everywhere, impacting those costs. In Canada, additionally, large projects awarded with a value of over $100 million have increased in volume by 25% the first part of this year.
Baker said the economy is showing significant signs of recovery, as did Associated General Contractors of America chief economist Ken Simonson.
So far this year, we're seeing the beginning of a rebound. As you can see here, spending is up 6.3% through the first quarter of this year relative to the first quarter of 2021, with strong growth in several commercial industrial sectors, particularly retail and manufacturing. The institutional side overall generally still weak, but many sectors appear to be hitting bottom at present. In terms of where the industry is headed, the Architecture Billings Index continues to show favorable business conditions at architecture firms. So design activity precedes construction activity, no surprise there, and our research indicates that the ABI accurately predicts construction activity with a 9 to 12 month lead. So in terms of recent trends, we had a strong upturn in our Billings Index in 2021. The scores began slowing in the fourth quarter of last year, which continued through January and February of this year. However, the March numbers you can see showed a surprising rebound, suggesting there's still a lot of momentum behind the non-residential construction recovery. And we'll get the reading for April next week. And the strong growth that we've seen in new project activity coming into architecture firms is generally exceeding their ability to develop designs. And as a result, project backlogs have been growing at architecture firms nationally. So in the first quarter of this year, as you can see, project backlogs averaged 7.2 months, meaning that firms could keep their staff fully employed for 7.2 months without any new work coming in. That's the highest level in backlogs in the more than 10 years we've been tracking this indicator at the American Institute of Architects. And one of the sectors generating particularly strong growth during the profession is work on existing buildings, renovations, retrofits, additions, and so forth. We've been tracking the share of revenue at architecture firms that's generated by work on existing buildings for a couple of decades now. It was running about a third prior to the Great Recession. When the recession hit in late 2008 and 2009, this share jumped to about 45%. Not surprising given the decline we saw in new construction over this period. However, as the industry recovered, this share of work on existing facilities held steady, began to pick up toward the end of last decade, And an update we conducted just last month estimates that the share of work on existing facilities exceeded 50% for the first time since we've been tracking this information. What kind of reconstruction work are firms doing? We asked firms to indicate the most common goal of their portfolio of reconstruction projects over the past year. At the top of the list, as you can see, was adaptive reuse and building conversion, followed very closely by basic modernization, tenant fit-outs, additions, upgrades to the building shell, upgrade to building systems were other common objectives of reconstruction projects.
February 2020, the month before the pandemic caused such huge shutdowns and job losses. And then fortunately, things bottomed out just 2 months later in April of 2020. And by the end of that year, residential construction was back to the February 2020 level. It's grown very strongly since then. In fact, since I prepared this slide, we received the April figures, and residential construction is now up by 5.6% compared to February 2020, whereas total non-farm payroll construction, payroll employment is still down by 0.8%, and non-residential construction employment, which stalled for over a year from June of 2020 to August of 2021, has been climbing somewhat more slowly, and it's still down about 3.5%. But as the next slide shows, it's not necessarily a lack of demand for workers that has kept non-residential construction employment down. These two lines come from the Bureau of Labor Statistics job openings and labor turnover, or JOLTS survey. And the job openings line, the blue line, soared to 415,000 openings at the end of March 2022. That was not only was that up 20% from a year earlier, but it was by far the highest number of openings in the 22-year history of this series. In contrast, the number of people hired in March of 2022 was short of that number, 388,000, basically right in the middle of the range that we've seen over the last 15 years for hires. So the implication here is that contractors would have hired twice as many people as they were able to find in the month of March. And we've seen similar comparisons in February and earlier months. So while construction employment is still down on the non-residential side, it's really because there aren't enough workers available. In fact, the unemployment rate for people with construction experience who are currently out of work and looking for a job is at an all-time low for April, 4.6%. Well, the next slide shows that this picture really varies a lot depending what state you're talking about. Here again, we've compared the February 2020 employment level in each state with the March 2022 level. And now 32 states have surpassed that February 2020 level. They're the ones in green, and 16 states still lag. The leaders are concentrated in the Intermountain West plus South Dakota. Those states in deep green have surpassed the February 2020 level by 10% or more. But a whole lot of states now are at least a little bit above. And the ones that lag, they're really scattered. There's no single story that explains that. Well, let me show you one other thing about the labor force. And this is a series called Average Hourly Earnings of Production and Non-Supervisory Employees. Basically, that's hourly wages for craft workers and office workers in construction. And in March, this series, this index had jumped 6.2% from a year earlier. That was more than double the increase of a year before. So wages have started going up much more rapidly. In fact, that 6.2% was the highest year-over-year change for any month since 1982. But other industries have been raising wages even more, and this has added to construction problems in attracting workers and retaining them.
Carrick said there are new projects such as hydrogen plants and other innovative initiatives involving liquefied natural gas, ammonia, and bio-based plastics.
There's projects that are new, that we really haven't seen before, like hydrogen. A lot of people think hydrogen's the answer to the energy shortage. There's projects that are planned for Texas. There's 3 hydrogen plants planned for Alberta, one in Montreal at Varennes using electrolysis, and ammonia plants. Japanese power plants, they've got a pilot project where they're going to try and burn ammonia to heat up water to get the steam to turn turbines. And LNG facilities. I mean, the next starts month, we're going to have a huge project. The Driftwood project in Louisiana is going to appear in there. There's a big difference between the price of natural gas in North America and much higher prices in Europe and Asia and so on. So there's tremendous opportunities in LNG along the coasts of the US and along the east and west coasts of Canada as well. And then Cargill. Cargill's building a plant in Iowa called butanediol. And what that's going to do is it's going to make some kind of plastics out of corn. So what I'm telling people when I'm doing these presentations anymore is it's a real help if you know your chemistry. And there's all kinds of projects in Canada. It's the same story. There's investments to be carried out in the auto sector and battery plants and electric power. For example, Ontario Hydro is planning something called a SMR, a small modular nuclear reactor at the Darlington generating station. And Canada has potash mining and it's got gold mining. And we haven't seen these sorts of things in a long time, like 10 years or so.
Guck pointed out that construction labor wages are strong, but inflation is rising, causing the cost of living to increase.
In the Midwest and the South, wages have increased the fastest since COVID. Wages are up currently, just over 5% for both of those territories. In the West, it's up a little below 5%, and then the laggard here, relatively speaking, is the Northeast, with year-on-year wages up just over 4.5%. And one of the challenges that we have to remember with this is that, and my heart goes out to those firms that are trying to do work and to find the right number of laborers. For many of them, maybe your accountants are writing larger checks or putting more money aside for wages than ever before on a year-over-year basis. And the struggle there is that I don't think a lot of firms are maybe getting the respect from their employees that they should be due, because the employees are saying, look, you gave me a 5% wage increase. That's great. That might be the most that I've seen as a worker in many years. The challenge is that I still have to cut back my family's standard of living by 3% if we assume, for example, that inflation is around 8% on average for the year. And so these are a lot of the challenges that employers and employees have to face, and there needs to be an understanding between those groups in order for things to, I think, transition, right, as we keep moving through our supply chain challenges and this very unique economic environment that we're dealing with.
If you'd like to see the full webcast and other webcasts we've held in the past, you can go to ConstructConnect.com/webcast videos. And if you'd like to listen to the Construction Record podcast on both Wednesday and Friday, you can go to Apple Music, Amazon Music, and Spotify, and listen to us on the Daily Commercial News and Journal of Commerce websites. Thanks, and we'll see you next week.